In Chapter 5, we're going to talk about the opposite of ventilation. We're going to talk about exhaust systems. Remember in Chapter 4 we talked about the bringing air into the building. All the code in Chapter 4 was about ventilation, how we're going to bring fresh air into the building for occupancy comfort and safety. Chapter 5 talks about how we're going to take air out of the building with exhaust systems. We need to make sure that any fumes, any hazardous material, anything that people can breathe in come out of the building. And that's the reason for the exhaust codes. The other purpose of the exhaust codes is we have to talk about where we can put the exhaust outlets, where I can exhaust all these hazardous materials, sometimes hot materials, into. We don't want to put it right into people's way in walkways. We don't want to burn people. We don't want to put it in an area where it can be sucked into a ventilation system either. So, starting with section 501, which once again, as with any other code, is a general code. It talks about discharge exhaust, it talks about location of exhaust, and it talks about pressure equalization, because it can actually pull a building into what we call a negative pressure, which could cause all sorts of problems with combustion systems. Section 502 talks about the required exhaust systems. What is absolutely required in an exhaust system? We talk about where exhaust is with aircraft fueling and defueling operations, battery charging areas for powered industrial equipment. Talks about stationary battery storage system, lead acid batteries, hydrogen limited cabinets. It talks about exhaust for dry cleaning plants. The code talks about applications of flammable finishes, for example, a paint room. It talks about exhaust obstructions, independent ductwork. It talks about dipping operations. You'll notice as we go through it, every single new section of code builds upon it. So for example, when we talk about dipping operations, we're in 502.7.4. Okay, then we have 502.7.5. Then we move to a new main section, 502.8. We're going to talk about hazardous material and the exhaust having to do with hazardous materials. Then we have hazardous material required for specific materials. Okay, for example, compressed gases, medical gas systems, corrosives, cryogenics, explosives. All hazardous materials, but they have specific code for these applications. Then we move on to highly toxic compressed gases. What's required for the gas cabinets, how much exhaust in feet per minute or feet per airflow. Exhaust enclosures. How do we protect the actual exhaust systems? We continue to move through here, and every one of these areas has to do, in 502, has something to do with a specific material. So if you're doing anything in terms of building, or if there's a change in occupancy or change in purpose, you need to take a look at section 502. Section 503 talks about the motors and fans, what the requirements are. It starts off with saying motors and fans shall be sized to provide the required air movements. It also specifies that motors in areas that contain flammable materials and dust shall be approved for such an environment. We don't want to create sparks. Fans are discussed, and the equipment and appliances identification plates are required. In certain areas, we must have corrosive resistant fans. Section 504 talks about clothes dryer exhaust. 505, domestic kitchen. Domestic means residential, homes. Section 506 talks about commercial kitchen systems, and this is very important if you do any restaurant work. You do need to read this area and be very familiar with the requirements. Again, most of this, especially areas such as grease, has to do with fire protection. Okay, grease duct fire resistive access openings, outlet servicing for the types and terminations above the roofs. Section 507 talks about commercial kitchen hoods. That's the inside of the exhaust system. It feeds the exhaust. And it will come down here talking about flames. Height above cooking surface. If without an exposed flame, half a foot. With exposed flames and burners, 2 feet. So it's very important you understand the different exhaust systems and the requirements. Section 508 talks about makeup air. Again, an exhaust will pull a building into a negative pressure. So I have to have makeup air that will raise the pressure of that area by bringing in outside air to make up what I'm leaving. Section 509 talks about fire suppression systems, when it's required, where it's required, and it does refer to International Building Code and International Fire Code for more information on this. Now, what International Mechanical Code is saying, you have to go there to get the information. It's not part of the Mechanical Code. Do you still have to do it? Yes. 510 talks about hazardous exhaust systems. Could be dust, could be chemicals, could be heat. It's hazardous. Section 510 also talks about fire suppression systems and other such issues. Duct thicknesses are discussed in 510, and 511 talks about dust, stock, and refuge conveying systems. Smoke control systems are in 513, and you have to realize that we cannot have smoke traveling in ductwork. The remainder of the chapter talks more about smoke controls, and then in 514 talks about energy recovery systems, which is a new addition to the code. You have to be aware of it.